because a couple of people had asked me if I was recording the session because, you know, it's Easter and everything. So some people are away. Can you believe it? They're away and they're missing this session. But yeah, that's how it is. So I thought I'd record today's session so that for the benefit of people who can't attend live. And so what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to run through a couple of, well, I'm going to hopefully try and attempt to do, it'll depend partly on how much time we have. I'm going to aim to do this in an hour. So it's a bit of a task. But what we're going to do is I'm going to have a look at a directed writing task response. So it's a real student's response. And that's what we're doing today. So how many of you, just to get an idea, how many of you have actually had a chance to look through the stimulus texts that we're basing, that the responses we're looking at are based on? It's okay if you haven't, but I just thought it might be helpful to give you some context and to understand what the passages were about. If you haven't looked at all of them, I know I only posted about them yesterday. So it occurred to me that rather than use time in this slot to read the passages, which you could do on your own in your own time, it would be more useful to spend more time looking at responses, because it's always useful to look at what other students have done and to kind of use that as a gauge for working out do's and don'ts, really, and what you want to do and what you want to hopefully avoid, right? And there are, just for those of you who know, maybe some of you maybe don't know, there are exemplar booklets out there as well. There are a candidate, so Cambridge produce a candidate exemplar booklet, which is a bit like, it occurred to me this morning, it's a bit like what I'm going to be doing today with you, which is looking through responses and thinking about strengths and weaknesses and what examiners had commented on in those responses. But I'm going to go into a little bit more depth and detail, hopefully. And so we're going to aim to look at a directed writing task response. We're going to look at 2 descriptive compositions, and I'm only focusing on descriptive. So if you're a fan of narrative, apologies, but I do think, and it is something that I recommend to most students, that descriptive is much more doable in the time frame you have, and you don't have to think about plot and character and so on. So that's why I've chosen, and I think most students do go for the descriptive options. That's why I've chosen to focus on that. I did think about it, whether to include a narrative, but I only wanted to sort of, we've got a limited amount of time, so I thought it'd be best to focus on what would help most students and focus on that. And then if we have time, I'm going to try and squeeze in an extended response task and a writer's effects question, which I'm not going to be able to look at in its entirety, but I'll pick out a few examples, and hopefully that will be helpful to you guys. As ever, please do feel free to comment in the chat. And as I say that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the chat and I'm going to set it so you can only communicate directly with me. Okay, so that way nobody feels like they're distracting anybody else. And if they'd rather sort of share something with me privately rather than everybody in the group, you can do that. Okay, so that's just something I do in most of my sessions. As most of you have been to my sessions or have attended my classes, so you'll be familiar with that. Right, should we get cracking? Because you've got quite a lot to cover. I'm just going to have a quick look just to check there's nobody waiting to be let in. No, I think we are all here, present. So let's start, shall we? Let's do it. Okay. Right, so the purpose, as I said, is we're going to talk through some candidate responses. We're going to highlight key aspects. And to do that, and as I said that, somebody's just joined the waiting room. Okay. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Taking time out of the Easter break to join us. Okay, that's great, thank you. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at some of these candidate responses. We're going to highlight key aspects. And in order to do that, we need to compare them to mark schemes. So we're going to have a quick run through what the mark scheme indicated responses might include. Okay. We're going to look at strengths of responses, because it's always important to focus on strengths, as well as how to improve weaker areas. And human nature being what it is, we tend to focus on the negative. So it's always good to celebrate the positive as well, right? And recognize when things go well and when we're doing things well, and give ourselves a pat on the back for that too. Okay, so that's important. And also we're going to look at how to improve, how to build on some areas which might need some work. And in the process, I'm going to highlight a couple of common pitfalls with some of these tasks and things to avoid really when you're doing your exam responses. And as I said, we're going to have a look at the directed writing and descriptive composition tasks, and we're going to have a look at an extended response task and a writer's effects question if we have time. So without any further ado, we're going to have a look at the first task. Now, what I've got here is the question. As I said, I'm not going to focus on the passages that the response was based on, because I don't think that's the best use of our time. So this task was a directed writing task on the 2020 paper from the May-June sitting. And this is paper 2. So it's the directed writing task. So imagine you are a parent of a student who attends a school that is considering a student exchange program. Write the speech. So there's your text type speech you give at a meeting for parents and teachers about whether it is a good idea for the school to run a study exchange program. Now, in my exam preparation course, most of you who attended, you'll know that the first thing I do before I look at a response is we look at the question, don't we? So the first thing to work out from this question is what kind of style do I need to adopt? So we know what text type, right? The key question here is, who is our audience? We know the text type. We know the audience, parents and teachers. So it's going to be important when you see that, you're going to recognize that you're going to have to make some reference to what parents and teachers may be concerned about when it comes to thinking about running a student exchange program, a study exchange program. And your task is to consider in your speech whether it is a good idea for the school to run a study exchange program. And that's quite important because, as you'll see, hopefully some of you will notice when I read the response in a moment, there's an issue with it in terms of the purpose. So we know what text type it is. We know who the audience is. The purpose, I want you to have a think about the purpose. What is the purpose of the speech, okay? In your speech, you need to do these two things. You need to evaluate. Now, this is particularly if you're aiming for top marks, evaluating the ideas is really, really important. You cannot get a top level response, top band response without evaluating the ideas, okay? And the opinions given in both texts. So you'll remember that there are 2 passages you're basing this response on. And part of what you'll need to do is identify the points in both passages and also evaluate them and synthesize them. Synthesis we've talked about in the exam preparation course, drawing those elements together, combining them, integrating them in a cohesive way. Okay, you also need to give your own views based on what you've read about whether your child would benefit from a study exchange visit, and that's your own views based on the passages. Okay, so not bringing in random other ideas from outside the world of the passages, okay? You need to have everything rooted in the passages. That's a very important thing to bear in mind. Don't bring in any additional ideas which aren't related in some way, directly or indirectly, to those expressed in the passages. You can develop ideas, and you should actually aim to develop and take further some of the ideas in the passages. That's a definite, but don't bring anything that can't be rooted in what they call tethered to the passages, okay? You have to base your speech on what you've read in both texts, but as you know, be careful to use your own words. So you are not lifting from the passages, using word for word what's said in the passages. And you need to make sure you're looking at both these points, okay? And there's your guidance. And to be honest, as I've said, most of you will know, I've said that when I try to do these tasks, I never manage to stick to that word limit. If you can, that's brilliant. I think it would be quite difficult for a lot of students to adequately address the points in sufficient depth with that number of words. That's really just about a side, a bit more than a side. So, and remember that this isn't a word limit. If you write more than that, it's okay, so long as you're not waffling and going off topic and, this is the quality of the response as well as the quantity. It's not just writing for its own sake. Now, the marks, you'll know, 15 marks are available for content, so that's the ideas from the passages, and 25 marks for the quality of your writing. So that's the bulk of the marks for the quality of your writing. Okay, so that's important to remember. I'm just going to see if I can remove the taskbar, because for some reason it's decided to show up there and it never does. Let me see. Okay. I think I'm going to have to leave. Oh, there, it's disappeared now randomly. Okay. It doesn't normally show, so I don't know why it started doing that randomly today. Okay. Hopefully you can all read that text. Can you see it? Can you read it all okay? I'm going to read through the response. So this is the actual student response I received. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read through it. Can you let me know if you can all read it okay? I hope you can. So I'm going to read through it and then we're going to have a look at the mark scheme. Excellent, excellent, thank you. Right, I won't bother, this is a question I've just read through, so we'll just start with the passage, okay? The response. Good evening to you all. I am here to discuss what seems a rather controversial topic amongst both parents and teachers of this school, the introduction of a study exchange programme. As a parent, I believe my 14-year-old could benefit hugely from this, and so could yours. My child is over the moon at the thought of a chance to go abroad and explore the different experiences to be had studying in different areas. We as a family do not often get the chance, chance has been crossed out, the time nor the money to travel, even if it is just for the sake of education. Any chance for a change in view is enough for her. While my daughter may view this as an exciting change, I believe there are more benefits to this than meets the eye. During the time leading up to the trip, students will be encouraged to work harder, their sole source of motivation being the chance of getting selected for the trip. Naturally, there would be a little competition amongst them all, but how could our school complain about that? We would only be handwriting, guys. There are no marks for pretty handwriting, but make sure it's legible, because it's really frustrating when you're marking responses. You have to look at what this person has written. You're trying to decipher it. Okay, so just make sure you are writing clearly. It doesn't have to be pretty, but you should be able to read it. Okay, where are we? We would only be increasing their chances of good grades. Speaking of which, a change in surroundings and a new environment can be beneficial for them mentally. And well, a mentally healthier student equals better motivation, and better motivation equals better grades. It's simple maths, really. Being stuck within the same four walls every day becomes exceedingly dull, and the amount of pressure on our kids for exams next year is intense. They need that time away. I'm sure you're all feeling that as well. Teachers often complain about the hassle of arranging this for our students. They would argue that their job is merely to prepare them for their future. What is failing to be recognized is that this will benefit their future as well as their present. These trips open new doors for students in so many ways, whether it is the learning of a new language, the realization of wanting to work abroad, or the exploration of different cultures and educational methods. I'm just going to have to, oh God, it's just the taskbar thing is really annoying. Hold on a sec. These trips will open new doors for students in so many ways, whether it is the learning of a new language, the realization of working abroad, the exploration of different cultures and educational methods. Not only would this program take a different perspective on education, but it would also help build character. Now, that may not be a teacher's primary role, but is it not their role to ensure a valuable education? Is sitting by a desk all day the only doesn't that, I think that's a mistake there. The only way this is thought to be achievable. I believe that the responsibility of this all should lie with teachers, and I do not think a single ounce of the effort involved would be wasted. A sense of responsibility and maturity is needed for students for this exchange, and I understand the concern around children struggling to be away from their families, but would you not agree that adjusting to new settings and situations is a vital skill in life? Think back to your first job or first interview, perhaps. For those of us who have rarely been who have rarely been thrown in situations and environments that were so new to us, adjusting to that change was quite a task. Yeah, there's something not quite right about that sentence. This student exchange program is a proofread, guys. Proofread your work, read your work through built-in proofreading time, okay, to check everything makes sense and is grammatical and there's no mistakes, missing words, missing apostrophes, commas, etc. For those of us who had, I think there's a tense issue there as well. For those of us who had rarely been thrown in situations and environments that were so new to us, adjusting to that change was quite a task. The student exchange program is a perfect taster experience for certain aspects in the workplace, and starting younger only makes their future easier. I would also hope this exchange would broaden young minds by exposing them to different situations other kids their age may I can't read it properly, it is crossed out something. I did read this beforehand. I did manage to read right through it. Other kids their age may have to work uh, to possibly make, I think it says, making them more grateful for the the resources available to them. Very hard to read. Can you read resources there? But the resources available to them in their own school. Okay, maybe that's pushing it, but I do think it can be a great inspiration to see that success is possible, no matter where you start from. It all starts from them, and that can only be a greater motivation to make them to push themselves to do better. The institution they start in does not shape their future; they do. Okay, so I hope this. You'll be pleased to know that the other responses are all I've typed them up, so they're a bit easier to read. But I thought it'd be useful to start with a handwritten one because it shows you that it's very important to have handwriting that you can read and that sentences make sense. So take on those two things as well. Okay, those two aspects when you're writing your responses. Right, so this is what it said in the mark scheme. Responses might use these ideas. So text A, hopefully some of you have read the passages, but these are the ideas they were looking for to be incorporated in that response. And have a think about whether you think the response I've just read to you has mentioned. They wouldn't expect you to mention all of these. Somebody asked me recently when I was marking their paper, how many ideas would you be expected to include from here? Certainly not all of them. A good selection, I would say. I know that's a bit vague, but a good sort of selection from both texts. I'd say maybe 3 points at least in depth. And then we'll be looking at in a moment on the next slide at synthesis and evaluation points, which differs from the extended response task from paper 1, which doesn't involve that same level of, there is development on the extended response task, but there isn't kind of evaluation in the same way. So some of the ideas they were looking for, or they would expect students to pick up on in the passages they were given, that exchange visits can be thought of as a waste of time for students at an important stage of their studies. Exchange visits can be expensive. Exchange visits can divert resources schools need. Obviously, it costs, so that takes some of the budget away from other things, mainly education, in terms of delivering academic success or the means by which academic success is achieved. Exchange visits can divert resources schools need. Visits visits needed may foster, I don't know why it says need may, this is directly from the mark scheme, may foster responsible, mature students. Students may appreciate their education more after a visit to other schools. That was mentioned, wasn't it, in the passage? Students' ambitions may be nurtured by a visit abroad. And also they won't expect you to put these down exactly in the way it's worded here. So if you've got the idea, that's enough to get the mark, okay? Visits offer a different kind of learning outside the classroom. That point was also made in the passage, in the response. Understanding and tolerance between cultures is important. So those were the ideas mentioned in the first passage. In the second one, first responsibility of a school is to educate. 4 weeks learning is a lot to lose. So you can see, you'll notice that the passages take a different tone, right? Those of you who had a look at it will be familiar with it. But essentially the first passage was kind of thinking about some of but broadly it was in favor. And the second one was kind of highlighting some problematic aspects and negative aspects of schools adopting these study exchange programs. The second text argued, they were both written by head teachers as well. The second text argued that schools' primary role, their first job, that's your paraphrase there, the first responsibility of a school is to educate. There's something I want you to think about there. Could you have a but? But think about what the but might be. 4 weeks learning is a lot to lose. Time consuming for teachers to organize. 4 weeks away on their own is too long for 14-year-olds. Different school environments may induce envy. The visit may lead to the loss of good workers for their country. That's a bit of a stretch, I think, but it's a possible point there. Potential visits can't be measured. So how do you know what the value is? You can't quantify it, right? Teacher time would be diverted from their main role. And so the response of the student did kind of hint at that, okay? So a key point here is you need to include a range of ideas from both passages. Now, I've marked responses recently, couple, where students have focused more on one than the other. In one response, I remember the student only mentioned ideas in the first text and didn't say anything about the second one, and that's not enough. Okay, so make sure you've got a balance. And I want you to think about those of you who've done my course this term. Well, now I talk about ping pong, right? So ping pong, going back and forward, back to and fro between the pros and the corresponding cons. You'll see some of those ideas in both texts could be paired up. Think about how they might be paired up and use balancing words and phrases. So on the one hand, student exchange visits might be thought of as a waste of time. That was a point made in the second text as well. However, maybe it's time well spent. Maybe it's an investment in students' futures because it offers them different experiences. Maybe it enhances the learning experience in different ways. Maybe it helps them to strive and their ambitions. And maybe it might actually aid their understanding in their academic subjects also. There's other dimensions to it. Now, remember I said there's a but, okay? There's a potential but that you could consider. The first responsibility of a school is to educate. The but is, how do we define education? So that's what I mean about taking the idea forward and developing it, right? So underlying this is a fundamental difference in what education is. Both of these teachers have different ideas about what education should mean. We have a kind of unique perspective on that as home educators, I think, but maybe that gives you an insight in a way to if you're answering this question. What is the purpose of education? Is the purpose of education just about getting good grades, or is it something more than that? And that's sort of one of the key sort of elements of evaluation there, which is not specifically mentioned in either of those passages, but it's sort of implied that one person writing the second text certainly thinks that the primary purpose of education, schooling, is to enable students to get good grades, whereas the first piece was written by somebody who thinks that learning outside the classroom, understanding other cultures and so on, exposure to other ways of life and other environments is valuable and is part and parcel of what education should be about. So there you can see what I mean? So that's the kind of thing you're trying to do with this directed writing task. So key point here, you want to include a range of ideas from both texts, okay? And some possible evaluation ideas. So there are also some ideas related to the costs, okay? So there is costly to schools and it's costly to parents. Maybe some might see that as unfair. Some people will be able to access that and others won't, because if there's a parental contribution and parents can't afford it, then those kids might be denied that opportunity. So there's inherent inequality of a scheme which costs parents. Interrupted education may be risky. Keeping up with work while away seems unlikely. So you might say you can keep up with work online and so on, but how realistic is that? I mean, come on, you're away for 4 weeks from school and you're excited in this new environment. Is it realistic to expect 14-year-olds to keep up with their schoolwork online, even if they have the opportunity to? Selection of students will favour only a few, those who will have a broader education anyway. So Some students might be more likely to get onto the program, and those students may be more likely to have opportunities to travel anyway. Some candidates may suggest the benefit or reputation of the school is the real agenda, not the student. Some students will leave their home country as a result of an exchange visit. Is this desirable? And this is the point I was making, raises the question of what is a good education. Text B, the head teacher has quite a narrow view of education. Students are meant to keep up with their schoolwork on the visit. The head teacher's view of teenagers is paternalistic, untrusting, thinks they're immature. In other words, it's kind of a bit condescending and patronizing to young people to say they lack the maturity, or it's just kind of almost like a waste of time for them to do this because they're not mature enough to get the most out of it, and it's a waste of their learning time that could be spent in school studying for exams and so on, and it's a waste of school resources and teachers' time and energies. The head teacher who wrote the second text, you could argue, is quite defensive in the passage about how students will view their school on return. She calls into question the role of a teacher. This is something that was mentioned in the response. This head teacher's view is quite narrow and dated. Not all benefits are measurable, but visits might still benefit students. Now that's a subjective thing, isn't it? Because if it enriches a student's learning experience, if they get something from it, that is a positive, but you can't measure that, you can't quantify it, can you? So that's a difficulty. Good grades aren't the only measure of a good education. So that's a point that could be made based on the views expressed in the second text. Possible synthesis there. So that's how you might integrate the views expressed in both passages. There are risks involved, but also benefits. The stance on exchange visits reflects how people think about education. Okay, so that's what was in the mark scheme. This is the feedback. So I know there's a lot to digest on here, but this is the feedback that I had on this response. First of all, using punctuation, advanced punctuation like semicolons and colons and things can boost your marks. Okay, so if you know and you can show that you can use punctuation correctly, it's in the mark scheme, you can be rewarded for that. You also need to show an awareness of your audience. So speak in a way using language that is tailored to who you are speaking to. Connect with the audience. It's a speech, so using personal inclusive pronouns, using ours, we, us, or speaking directly to the audience as in you, so there's a sense of personal connection there, is effective and appropriate for this. The style and tone is informal. In some places there are, some conversational aspects to the speech. So my child is over the moon. Maybe that's pushing it, she says, towards the end, right? So those kinds of turns of phrase are appropriate. Also, that maybe it's pushing it, use of humor, right? That's also another effective technique there. This candidate seemed to imply that they, as a family, don't get to go on holiday all that much, so it's a good opportunity. That doesn't sound like a very strong argument to me. It sounds like it would give support to the idea that schools shouldn't run these programs because they just offer subsidized holidays to students. It just makes it sound like it's a holiday, just a little bit of fun, rather than having educational value. And that money, therefore, should be spent elsewhere. I think that might undermine the argument. Instead, I think the focus should be deliberating, kind of discussing and exploring the various points in favor of and the counter arguments that could be made, going back and forth between the pros and the cons, reaching a conclusion at the end. My child is ecstatic about the opportunity to, and that was referenced in the question. So the student did that. How you feel about your child going on this exchange program. Important to mention that the points should be linked to the ideas and arguments expressed in the passage, and those should be developed. I've mentioned that previously. How will these students be chosen? She does reference something to do with the maturity of the students. She doesn't mention how these students will be chosen, and that might lead to accusations of unfairness. She's got a suitable tone throughout, so the tone and the style and the vocabulary are appropriate. She's recognized who she's supposed to be speaking as and who she's talking to as a parent. So speaking from personal experience, my personal standpoint as a parent, that makes the case more convincing, because who would be supporting this scheme? You wouldn't be supporting this scheme and saying that my child should go on it you know, if you didn't think it was a good thing, right? If you're saying it's good enough for my child, then it must be worthwhile, right? And that gives strength to your argument. Is it appropriate to state, as she does, if it is just for the sake of, even if it is just for the sake of education, the audience is teachers and parents. So educational outcomes are important. So it's sort of saying, even if it's just for the sake of education, I think undermines that a bit. Again, suitable style where she says, I believe there are more benefits to this than meets the eye. She says something about how a change in surroundings in a new environment could be beneficial for students mentally, but she doesn't specify how. And I think that was a slightly off-topic point to mention because it doesn't really link to what's in the passages. So she's thrown that in randomly, but there's nothing to develop further because there isn't any suggestion of that in the passages. I'm not sure how teachers in the audience would take to this parent saying that lessons at school are increasingly dull. Remember who your audience is. It might be more appropriate to reserve judgment until the end. And a key point that I mentioned earlier on is the purpose. The purpose here was to discuss whether or not it was a good idea. That means you need to take a balanced tone throughout. You're not saying, it doesn't say, try to convince your audience that the study exchange program is a good thing. And that was a weakness in the response because this candidate thought that it was she took more of a persuasive style and it wasn't. So read the question carefully so you've got that focus right. Also, she mentioned something about students being in competition with each other. I don't think that's a selling point. I don't know if students would want, parents and teachers would want that kind of fierce competition to get selected, because it might mean those who aren't feel dejected, and there might be a sense of sort of superiority, inferiority between students, and it might lead to sort of tension and, you know, hostility and so on. So maybe that's not an ideal. I think there are better points that could be made based on the passages than that. Okay, so points that were made. Remember I said I'm going to focus on positives as well. She does mention about the point about teachers' time being wasted, and the counter view is that it's time well spent because it will prepare students for the future. She needs to do more of that, identify the argument, express it in her own words, suggest a counter argument. The idea of this exchange program taking a different, you know, the idea of students being able to take a different perspective, and that's a kind of, that being a more up-to-date approach to learning and education is a good argument. But I think that was something that she didn't state clearly enough in its own right. She sort of implied it. Saying something along the lines of, it depends on how you define education, that makes it then an evaluation point. That's a key kind of discussion point there. I'm not sure how teachers, again, this is being aware of who your audience is. I'm not sure how keen the teachers in the audience would be to hear you say that it's their responsibility to take on the additional workload. She said something like that towards the end. And it might be better to sort of show an indication that you understand their concerns about assuming additional responsibilities, and appreciate that this does involve a certain amount of extra work, but that you feel that's justified and it has the benefits hugely outweigh the costs, okay, literal costs as well as time and energy costs. There's a valid point made about maturity and broadening minds. There's good use of things, devices such as rhetorical questions, exclamation marks. There's good structuring and sequencing. There's connectives linking ideas. Speaking of which, that's a connecting phrase because it's referring back to what she said previously. So structure and sequencing, guys, really important. Variety of sentence types is there. So she uses simple, complex, compound, and she's got the variety of sentence openings, which gives it more interest. And she's got an effective conclusion. So some really good aspects, but some weaknesses also. So for improvements, mainly it is that she doesn't take the even-handed approach that is required here. It's more sort of one-sided in favor of. So really what you want to do is balance the pros and the cons, looking at different aspects, and then come to some sort of conclusion at the end. Identify the points, weigh up the merits and the weaknesses, the strengths, the positives, and the disadvantages and negatives of each of those ideas, and then develop some of those further. keep your audience in mind at all times. There are a few things I've just pointed out where it felt like she didn't recognize the concerns that teachers might have, or how they might not take too kindly to some of the things that she was saying, like it's all teachers' responsibilities, they can just do the extra work and that kind of thing. So just some general advice on how to approach this kind of task. You need to read both texts carefully, highlight and paraphrase the points in both passages that are relevant to the bullet points that are identified in the question. Once you've done that, group together pros and cons that pair up and that can be linked. Broadly, there are a few main areas to consider with this scheme. And this is how you could structure your piece. So you could talk about it in terms of, and these could form your paragraph plan. This could form your paragraph plan. So you could have a paragraph on the value or otherwise in educational terms. Some might argue there's little benefit for students in academic terms to take part in the scheme, whilst others might feel that it's relevant and it's applying knowledge they have, gives them the opportunity to take part in the scheme. Giving them the opportunity to take part in the scheme might enhance their learning experience, and that might in and of itself help improve their educational results and achievement, might raise achievement. There's another linked series of ideas that could be tied into how it might be of value to students themselves in personal terms, in terms of their self-development, their confidence, their life skills, their knowledge and understanding of the world, exposure to other cultures, improving empathy. That involves taking a broader view of what education means, developing that point. Do students necessarily have to go on trips to acquire these skills? Maybe you could do that at home. There's another aspect to consider, other experiences, for example, voluntary work, part-time employment. You could argue that it might improve their motivation and determination. It might give them an appreciation of what they have. She did make that point about resources, and maybe they're privileged. They have access to materials and resources and opportunities that maybe a lot of people and a lot of young people in the developing world, for instance, might not have. Cost issues related to the cost for schools. And really what you're doing is a cost-benefit analysis. Is the cost worth the benefits or not? And then there's the practicality. So the time needed that teachers need to put into this to organize it and set it up, the energy and the resources. So those are kind of your broad ideas. And within that, you can see how some of those points can be pulled out and linked to those kind of topic areas, if you like. Okay, now, this is what I would suggest she does. Start with a series of paragraphs, an introduction, and then you have a series of paragraphs, each of which looks at some of the issues identified that we've just looked at: cost for parents, cost for schools, value and disadvantages, and so on. And then what you want to do is think about what the most important issue is and start with that, then the next most important, the next most important, remembering that your audience is teachers and parents. So what would be of most concern to them? And probably the impact on their child's education is the number one thing, maybe more than the cost. And then the pros and the cons you need to weigh up. And then here's an example evaluation and conclusion. So hopefully you'll see that it's got a more measured, balanced tone to it. Whether you regard these kinds of schemes as worth the time, energy, and resources that must be invested in them depends to a great extent on how we define education. Viewed in narrow, some might say outdated terms, education is solely about the provision of teaching and preparing students for exams. However, a more broadly conceived notion of education encompasses the idea of equipping students with vital life skills, making learning and the acquisition of knowledge not only valuable in and of itself, but also as relevant and meaningful for students and as a means of understanding the world around them. Although not everyone here will be in agreement, I feel on balance that the student exchange program would certainly be a wonderful opportunity for my child, who is looking forward to the experience for all sorts of reasons, and surely to fire our young people's enthusiasm and passion for life and learning would make the time, energy, and resources invested worthwhile. So a rhetorical question to finish, and a metaphor there: fire our young people's enthusiasm, passion for life, another one. So the response that I read to you was actually an A grade response. I gave it 68%. So the quality of writing was good. The tone, style, awareness of conventions of a speech, rhetorical questions, direct address, rule of three. Remember the DeForest techniques, guys. Write it in the margin if you're asked to write a speech. Remember you're doing that. And I think what was missing was, and you'll notice the writing mark was quite good. The reading mark, I lost marks because I don't think there was enough of a range of points and evaluation of that. Okay, that took me considerably longer than I thought it would. So let's move on. We're now looking at descriptive composition. Hopefully you guys found that helpful, looking at the directed writing task in some depth and detail, which I think you kind of need to do if you're going to really get to grips with what's required if you want to get a good grade. Let me know in the chat if you have any questions on that. I'm going to move on to descriptive composition. So this is the second task on paper 2. I'm going to read another student response here. And as I read it, maybe you'd like to think, you know what I might do actually is I might actually skip forward and tell you what they're looking for, first of all. And then as I read it, you can think about whether the student has done that, okay? So for this question, what they want is for you to, there's lots of writing objectives. The emphasis was on the writing, okay? Because it's the writing paper that this appears on. 40 marks for this question, a quarter of your grade. So they want students to be able to articulate, experience, and express what is thought, felt, and imagined. Organizing and structuring your ideas. And a plan helps here, guys, okay, for deliberate effect. So thinking about what you're going to write about where, what you're going to start with, what's going to come in the middle, what's going to come next, and what's going to come at the end is very important, mapping it out, okay? Using a range of vocabulary and sentence structures appropriate to context, using a register, so that's a level of formality that's suitable, and spelling, punctuation, and grammar. This is a writing paper after all. The content for this is a top band response, band 6. So this is a top band, so the maximum number of marks you could get. They want complex, engaging, and effective content. The structure, remember I said the planning, think about how it's managed deliberately. This person is in control. It's not like a kind of runaway train that's running off the tracks and veering all over the place. You've got a clear idea of where you're starting from and where your destination is, and you're heading in that direction, okay? Many well-defined and developed ideas. So I want to focus on this word developed because a lot of the time students can include a lot of ideas but don't develop them fully. And it's not just about having as many ideas as you can crammed in there. It's about developing them and also varieties of focus, okay? So that's the top band. This is the band below. Structure is managed well. So it's basically the same things, but not done quite as well, okay? Key points to bear in mind here. Descriptive pieces are not narratives. They're not narratives. Don't let your descriptive piece turn into a story, okay? Because you will lose marks for it. Or you won't gain the marks you could get otherwise. You need to make it sound like a descriptive piece, not a narrative. And it's very easily done to let it slip into a story, okay? Structure and sequence your writing, I've mentioned, and include varieties of focus. So zooming in, zooming out, panning, tracking, you'll know the score, right? Vary your sentence types, sensory details, imagery, and figurative language are key. If you're focusing on sensory details, imagery, and figurative language, and that is core to descriptive writing, you are less likely to slip into a storytelling mode, okay? So bearing that in mind, okay, I won't go to feedback yet. I'll read it, and then I'll go to the feedback, okay? Right, here we are. I'll read it. You tell me what you think in the chat if you like. Beneath the blanket of tumultuous charcoal black clouds, an infuriated tornado is hurtling with malicious intent towards, oh, I should have said what the title was. Describe the view from a window on a wet day. Okay, the view from a window on a wet day. Stay on that track, because I've read responses where people start talking about something else entirely. And it should be focused on describing the view from a window on a wet day, not lead into a story about something else, okay? Beneath the blanket of tumultuous charcoal black clouds, an infuriated tornado is hurtling with malicious intent towards the solitary, sleepy town. The merciless cyclone charges down the narrow country lane like a raging bull, whilst the marching thunder booms louder and louder with every step. Nothing can prepare the isolated place for the imminent invasion. A flash of fork lightning lights up the graphite grey sky, and the ear-splitting thunder claps again ominously. The terrifying thunder seizes the frail farm and uproots it from its foundation like a gardener ripping up an unwanted weed. It is a scene of destruction. Floorboards, furniture, and family possessions are flung into the cold, unwelcoming autumn air. Nothing is safe. It is a massacre, an annihilation. The storm does not discriminate against any item. It just wants to complete its mission of obliteration. Bright sparks of carmine red light up the murky sky. The clouds part as the opera of skies. The instruments determined to sing, the trees and grass as their percussion. The rain comes in an orchestrated rhythm. Inky sky coughed out great gouts of water. An unending cataract of water sluicing from the sky. Trees uprooted, cars and carts go bobbing by, I think is meant to be. An entire village disappears under a frothy lather of suds. Rain is incessant. It snaps and crackles. The floodgates in the sky have been opened and no one is there to close them. The tranquility in the immediate vicinity is marred by the aggression, rage, and fury. The wind howls like a desert banshee, and thudding thunder reverberates through the air once more. Boom! The previously placid and picturesque countryside is now a scene of devastation and destruction thanks to the horrific hurricane. The brutal tyrant has left a trail of devastation in its wake like a merciless war criminal. As the storm arches on to hunt its next I think it's meant marches, there's a missing M, marches on to hunt its next victim, the countryside becomes quiet. A deafening silence fills the autumn air, and the terrifying tornado disappears as quickly as it came. Golden rays of sunlight break the horizon, illuminating the pearly white droplets. The quaint cottages feel the sunlight, invigorate their polished surfaces, a reward for surviving the destructive night. Sky is blue and vibrant. Flowers in the meadow gape at the fluffy clouds. The clouds oblige and rain descends in the little gleam, drops of silver. The sound of rain is harmonic thrumming, nature's white noise. A homely baked earth smell rises from the land as it is cleansed and washed. Petrichor, the smell of rain, rises like miasma. Jasmine and tulip fragrance leave the land with sweetness. The rain plays the soothing pitter-patter tune. Plip, plop, plip, plop. The gushing water gurgles enigmatically. The sweet earthy smell begins to waft. It is bittersweet. The same scent brings news of the year's first rain, but also reminds people what gives life can take it as well. Petrichor begins to dissipate. I think there was just some random ideas at the end. So I put those in there. That's what he'd actually written on the paper. So random ideas, but hadn't actually kind of developed those, maybe ran out of time. Okay, so those were the criteria that we just looked at. So there were some good aspects and some weaker aspects of that. So first of all, this passage was quite long, but remember, this candidate wouldn't have been penalised for writing that much. That's fine. It was actually just under 500 words, which is not hugely, it's not, I mean, most people write about 300 words per side, so that's still less than 2 sides, which is quite doable in 1 hour. Feedback, there was some really nice imagery. Sensory details were in there. So we had sight, sound, smells, and textures conveyed quite effectively. There was some really good figurative language, some really nice similes, metaphors, personification, and pathetic fallacy that created, helped to create an ominous atmosphere and a kind of mood of foreboding. There wasn't, I mean, this candidate has a natural flair for creative writing, but there was some lack of control, I think, with the way in which it was structured and developed, which you might have spotted. There was also a little bit of work, I think, is needed on sequencing and organizing the ideas. I'm not sure if this candidate had actually planned his response, and it seemed to lose its way a little bit somewhere towards the end, right? And I think don't kind of neglect the structuring and sequencing aspects, because it sort of shows that the piece follows on kind of in a kind of logical way rather than sort of fizzling and kind of losing its way a little bit. In the middle there, we had that with this particular response. So there were varied sentence types in there, definitely. There were varied sentence starters. There was a range of punctuation. There was some short one-word sentences, boom, with an exclamation mark. That will earn you marks. Single word sentences for effect and dramatic impact with an exclamation mark there. The structure and sequencing, as I said, was a little bit too loose for my liking. It could have been a bit tighter. The focus has to be there throughout. The question was to describe the scene from a window looking out on a rainy day, but that strayed a little bit in some places, and there wasn't enough description about the rain. I don't think there was a lot of sounds and stuff. What about the rain, the appearance of the droplets? Remembering you're looking out from a window, right? So rain on the glass is probably the most obvious thing that this candidate didn't comment on. It doesn't say you're outside, you're looking through the window. So bear in mind, and that might give you an opportunity to have varieties of focus. So the rain as it is on the glass just in front of you, and the rain as it is further away in the distance beyond, in the background and foreground. So thinking about foreground, mid-range, and long distance, if you like, shots. And so this was an A grade, but it needed a bit of work, I think, in some places. But there was a lot of good stuff in there as well. That meant it was of A grade standard. So we've had 2 A grade pieces. This is a B grade. So I've got a variety. So the writer's effects and the extended response task are slightly lower band ones. And I deliberately did that because I wanted to point out some common mistakes that students make with those tasks. So you guys can hopefully avoid them, okay? So this is the next piece, considerably shorter than the other one, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean it's a worse piece in and of itself, but there are some issues with this, okay? For this task, this was the alternative descriptive task from the same paper that we just looked at. The descriptive writing task was taken. There were there's 2 options, right, for the descriptive and 2 options for the narrative. So this was the alternative descriptive question. Write a description with the title Camping Out. A small group of campers sat beside a yellow-orange fire. Warm flames flickered and danced around a group of cracking branches. Above, marshmallows mounted on sticks. And another thing is this candidate had a lot of spelling errors, okay? Some of them are still in there, so marshmallows, but I took quite a few of them out just for ease of reading. But please be careful about your spelling. I know some people struggle with that. If it's something that you kind of have to weigh up, is it something that just, some little mistakes can come in here and there? You can read those out by proofreading. If you struggle with spelling, don't worry too much about that. Just kind of forget the spelling and concentrate on the content, and aim for ambitious vocabulary, even if you're not sure of the spelling, because it will count for more rather than getting the spelling wrong. You see what I mean? Hopefully that makes sense. A small group of campers sat beside a yellow-orange fire. Warm flames flickered and danced around a group of cracking branches. Above, marshmallows mounted on sticks turn a crisp yellow-brown. The sky was carpeted with inky black and was peppered with stars, shining white and making patterns, belts and heads, clubs and swords. Tents lay on endless layers of leaves, stacked like millefeuille. The colourful tents were inhabited by campers wrapped in their sleeping bags. An owl swooped down from a nearby tree, guided by the soft moonlight. It caught a mouse. Guided by the soft moonlight, it caught a mouse. A hedgehog slowly stumbles through the leaves. It overturns the leaves, revealing its banquet of insects. The hedgehog returns to its hole, avoiding a nearby fox. Morning brings a new environment. Trees like statues of nature, covered with birds singing freely. A nearby pond is full with life. Fish fly freely through the water. Frogs feast on unfortunate insects. A thorn bush lies in wait like a tiger waiting for a perfect moment to strike an unsuspecting victim. A large gust of wind provided the perfect conditions. The bush waved its branches manically, sending sharp spines shooting speedily through the air. The spines cascaded over the trees, with the bush returned back to rest. The campers pack up and leave while nature carries on, unchanged. Right. You may have noticed as I was reading it, there is a problem with tenses in this passage. In some places, the student has used the present tense. And in other places, the student has switched to using the past tense. Now, that's going to impact your marks, because the thing is that if you're doing that deliberately because you're writing in the present and then you're writing a story and you're going into flashback and writing in the past, that's okay. I mean, and that will be obvious. But here, what we've got is a random switching between past and present. And that just looks like you don't know how to use tenses accurately and correctly. So sometimes students feel if you write in the present, it makes it sound like it's happening now and it gives it a sense of immediacy. And that can be the case. But the problem is that you might forget that you're writing in the present tense and slip into writing in the past tense, which is why I generally say, don't even go there. Avoid that problem unless you're absolutely sure you can stick to using the present throughout and that's what you're going for. Just write in the past tense because it's one less thing to worry about slipping into a different tense. Okay, so that's something you want to be aware of. Okay, there are some really good nuggets, I've said, of good descriptive elements, but there's quite a few sentences which feel like fragments. They sort of don't seem to be even complete sentences, and they don't feel connected. They feel a bit random. So one minute he's describing the marshmallows, the next minute he's describing the sky. What links the marshmallow to the sky? You know, it's sort of just a bit of randomness going on there. So that's what I mean about sequencing. So maybe you could have, if you're toasting the marshmallows, you could talk about the smoke rising up into the sky, and then that would track your gaze up to the sky, and then you could talk about the stars and so on. You see what I mean? Disappearing into the darkness above and the glint of the stars and so on. But you've got to have some sort of, can you see what I mean by sort of, it bridges the marshmallows and the sky. Otherwise, it just feels like you're just randomly jumping around from one thing to another and they're not connected. So that's what they mean by sequencing. They're looking for that. Think about how you connect those ideas. Again, they're sort of random descriptions, and none of these ideas is developed fully. There's sort of a sentence, a brief sentence in some places on one thing before you move on to another thing and another thing and another thing. We want detail. Detail is what brings it to life. You want to be able to picture that, you want the reader to be able to picture what you're describing because you've given it so much detail. So intricate details and sensory details. There are some, are there really? We've got mostly focused on sight. We don't really have any mention of sounds, cracking branches, I think. But there could be some more detail of that, right? Detail related to the way that the flames move. There's some personification there. There's some precise vocabulary there. There's some good adjectives and verbs in the piece. So there's some good aspects, but there are other bits which I think aren't fully developed. So there are some nuggets. The linking is a problem. Tenses is a problem. The sentences and the ideas and the paragraphs don't seem to follow on and be connected. You want to think of them like links in the chain, right? They're all linked. They're not just sort of random ideas. For example, the second paragraph could follow on from the previous one if you added, above the sleeping campers, the silence only broken by a soft sigh or snore, an owl swoops. So they have now moved from the campers to the owl, right? This incorporates, think about how you can incorporate things like alliteration, auditory imagery, and so on as well. You remember you need to include the full range of sensory imagery and details, references to touch, smell, taste, even could have included with marshmallows, something to do with taste, right? Many of the sentences touch too briefly on an idea and then move on to another idea in the next sentence. Try to focus on, and this is, it's the quality, not just the quantity, not just including as many different random ideas as you can, one on smells, one on sights, one on sounds, and so on. You want to actually make sure you're exploring them in depth. If you're going to mention it, you want it to be a longer sentence or a few sentences on one aspect, like the flames or the bird, the owl, you know what I mean? Use varied sentence types and openings, full range of punctuation, figurative language. So that's your similes, metaphors, personification, pathetic fallacy, sensory imagery, and so on. And go back to the mark scheme and remind yourself of what it is they're looking for, okay? So that's a B grade response. Now, do we have time, guys, to look at the extended response task? Who's gonna stay with me? Because I thought I'd do this in an hour. We did actually manage everything. I said if there was time, we'd do the extended response task. Let me know in the chat if you'd like me to go through this extended response task. And I can do a little bit maybe of the writer's effects to round up, because then we'll have a good selection, I think. Are you able to continue for a bit longer? I know it's quite intense, isn't it? Okay, all right, I'll carry on then. Carry on then. Oh, sorry, I skipped too soon there. So my mouse has gone a bit dodgy. Okay, here we are. Extended response task. This was taken from the October-November 2020 paper. So this is, you're being Jose. So important to remember, you're not yourself, you're this person, this character called Jose. So you're asked to write a journal entry in this piece, and you're asked to look at 3 aspects. Describe where you've been, what you've seen in the final stages of your adventure. Explain how you have felt during the recent days about the expedition and your leader, Raposo. Describe what has happened since you saw the broken remains of the human settlement. And I appreciate that for those of you who haven't looked at the passages, this might seem a bit sort of out of context, but as I said, I felt it was better to focus on the responses rather than spend time reading passages, which you guys can do in your own time, okay? Write the words of your journal, base your journal entry on what you have read in the text C, but be careful to use your own words. So remembering we're not copying, we're not lifting, we are paraphrasing, we're using synonyms to express the ideas. Address each of the 3 bullet points, important. And you'll see why I'm mentioning that, stressing that in a moment. Write about 250 to 350 words. 15 marks for the content. So you remember that's 5 pieces of information for each of these 3 bullet points, and 10 marks for the quality of writing. So this is on the reading paper, but there are still 10 marks available for the quality of your writing. So that's good. And 15 marks for the ideas in the passage that you're going to express that relate to these 3 bullet points. So let's look at the response. I have completed my search for the ancient mining city. In the final days of my adventure, Raposo sent Manuel and I to find firewood. While finding firewood, we had found a dead tree. Manuel followed a deer which ran from the tree to the other side of the creek in which we found the tree and disappeared past a corner of the cliff. Following the deer, Manuel found a cleft in the precipice, giving a path to climb to the summit of the mountain. After many hours of climbing, we found a man-made paving leading past crystals and quartz to remains of an ancient human settlement. There was no greater relief than realizing that our travels and troubles had not all been wasted. Even Raposo, who normally remains devoid of emotion, gazed wide-eyed around the settlement. Although annoying at times, Raposo was a hard-working, tireless leader. However, he still listened to his team and permitted rest when the party was tired. After seeing the remains of the ancient settlement, Raposo, the party, and I all gaped at our surroundings. They were ancient houses, broken and shattered by time. Gold, silver, and precious gems lay, strewn randomly across the ground and covered by inches of mud. After exploring the habitation more, Manuel found bones buried near the destroyed buildings. Thankfully, Raposo came prepared, taking a large sack out of his bag. We filled the sack with as much gold as we could carry and made a slow descent of the mountain. We still have far to go before we return to civilization, but we know we shall make a second voyage to the lost city. So, as I said right at the top, there's some positives and there are some weaknesses with this response. So here is what the mark scheme identified for the content ideas. Okay, so the A1 was the first section that you were asked to focus on. The bullet point, the first bullet point was where Jose has been and what he has seen. Make sure, guys, that you are paying attention and looking out for what I call the double-barreled bullet point, okay? So this is one bullet point, but if you look carefully, there's 2 ideas in it. It's 2 in 1. Where he's been and what he has seen, they are not the same. They are not the same. Where he's been it might involve, you know, what he's seen might be linked to where he's been, but you need to include both, okay? So the possible points here, terrain underfoot, so the detail is, and you want to include some detail and development too, okay? So the detail is what kind of landscapes, what kind of terrain are they crossing? Swamps, bush country. Some development based on that might be it was hard going, it was difficult to make progress, it was uncomfortable, they didn't know what to expect one minute to the next, right? The landscape, the view, You might talk about, you might mention there were some belts of forest and there was a mountain range. And to develop that, you might remember it's a journal entry. So it's not, and that was one of the weaknesses with this response. There was a bit too much factual, sort of matter-of-fact style statements in there. There wasn't enough about thoughts and feelings, because it's a journal entry. That's where you express your innermost thoughts and feelings, right? So what did you think being in this position? What impact did the scenery have on you? Was it impressive? Was it foreboding? Was it daunting? Did it fill you with dread or excitement, or a mixture of the two? The sunset on the mountainside was quite spectacular. So the detail there's quite a lot of in detail in the passage about that. The reflection of the light, the rock surface wet from the rain, the sparkling streams. So you can imagine that would fill you with a sense of awe, wonder. It was beautiful, or maybe it gave you the false promise of wealth, luring you into its trap, in urging you, kind of enticing you to carry on this fool's journey. There was a rainbow that was described in the passage. So this is the detail there. Maybe you foolishly thought, maybe it was childish of you to think of that as a sign of hope. The morning view of the mountain, so that was quite different to the sunset scene, dark and threatening. It was vast, unscalable. It looked very daunting and intimidating. There was quite a difference between that and the glow and the beauty of the scene the night before. Maybe that filled you with, maybe that made you feel discouraged, disheartened, despondent, dejected, all those kinds of things. Your route over the mountain. Now, what I've highlighted is the point. I've highlighted in bold the points that this candidate made. So you can see an issue, can't you? There are several points here. You're looking for 5 pieces of information, and this candidate only made one relevant point for that first section there. That's a problem, because you want to, and the first bullet point is just the explicit meanings, right? It's the straightforward facts you want to pick out from the passage, okay? Straightforward details of where he has been and what he saw, and included with that some reflection on what you felt and thought about that, okay? So this is kind of the straightforward section, right? But this candidate didn't really understand what he needed to do for this task. That's the thing, and it's very specific, right? And then there was a bit of lifting as well, so there wasn't enough paraphrasing of the points, so that was also a weakness. For the first part, you want to reference the difficulties of negotiating swampy ground with no idea what fresh challenges you might face next, making it through this section of your journey only to be faced with the daunting prospect of scaling a steep mountain range that lay beyond a strip of forest. So you want to include some straightforward details, where he's been, what he saw. The focus of paragraph 2 is quite important as well. We're going to see that on the next section. That is all to do with the sides of the mountain shining. Oh no, that's actually the detail about the second paragraph in the passage, I mean. The sunlight shining off the sides of the mountain, and there's vibrant amber and golden hues of sunlight radiating from the sun as it sank towards the horizon, and then suddenly a rainbow appeared. So it's got to feel personal, right? It's a journal entry, so you've got to show that you understand what a journal entry looks like. It's not a factual account or a report, so make sure it sounds convincing. Even though it's a fiction and it's made up and you've never been here and you're being somebody else who isn't you, you want to make it sound believable and credible and convincing and consistent and all of that, okay? And so you might say the sight of the rainbow filled you with optimism and offered the promise of untold riches. There's in the bold are some ideas for the kinds of points and the way you might express them, okay? So that's the first section. And then the next bit, I can get my taskbar to move out of the hold on a sec, there we go. Yeah, you could also reference the idea that the notion we had been given a sign of hope seemed foolish as we awoke to a very different sight. The mountains now loomed forbidding and treacherous, and it appeared an impossible task to climb their steep, slippery slopes. So you can see I've taken this fact, but I've given it a more personal feel and I've paraphrased. Okay, so that's the kind of and there's also some metaphorical and figurative language in there as well. So that gives it kind of flavor and interest, right? So forbidding and treacherous, like they could betray you. You know, and there's some sibilance there as well, steep, slippery slopes there, right? You could continue with this, how this left you feeling dejected, despondent, discouraged, wanting to give up and just go back home, until by chance you discovered a path through the mountains. It's important to recognize that the whole piece refers to the final stage of their journey. That's stated in the introduction to the passage. And so what this candidate had done is, he's focused on the second half of the piece only, rather than looking at the whole piece. And that limits the details and information that could be included. And it's a journal entry, which I just mentioned. So you must include thoughts and feelings and show that you know what a journal entry should look like. Otherwise, it just becomes an account. And you need to have some development and development of some of those ideas. So that's how that scene left you feeling, what your thoughts and emotions were, imagining that based on the information you've been given, and some details too, some specifics. Okay, so not just saying the terrain was difficult to navigate or negotiate. Well, you could talk about the swamps, you could talk about the forest, you could talk about the mountains and so on. There's different aspects to that. Because that's the first bit. And sorry, did I miss a bit? Oh, yes, here it is. A2, feelings during recent days, feelings about Raposo. So there's two aspects to that as well. Another double-barreled bullet point. So we've got not just what you felt recently in the last couple of days, but also your feelings about Raposo, who's the leader of your little expedition. Sorry, it keeps slipping. My mouse has got really sensitive. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, excuse me. Here we are. Sorry about that. So utterly exhausted. At this point, you are drained of energy. The detail is you're endless wandering before you arrive at the mountains. You're stumbling. You're a ragged bunch at this point, I think. You're struggling over boulders and crevices, looking for a way up the mountain. Your development might be that Raposo was too demanding. He was expecting too much. Or maybe it might be that he was good at motivating you to go on even when you were tired. You were disheartened at this point, so it's your feelings, right? So feelings, think feeling words. Disappointed, not to find anything initially. You weren't able to locate the mines. You didn't see any signs of any ancient civilizations, and you thought maybe at this point it was a waste of time. You were annoyed to be sent on an errand. The detail was that you were told to go and get firewood, fetch firewood, and you kind of not very keen on that idea. And maybe you think, oh, it's typical of Raposo to pick me. That's not fair. He let the others have a rest and he sent me to go and get firewood with Manuel. And maybe you might say that you felt Manuel's excitement was misplaced. And maybe he just takes Raposo's side. Unimpressed by Raposo as a leader. There's a clue there. Your mutinous expression might indicate that. Development feels like you're being taken advantage of, and maybe you think the others feel the same or not, as the case may be. Maybe over time, and given the outcome, the successful outcome of the expedition, you learn to value. Looking back, you can see that Raposo makes a good leader. He's good at cajoling and keeping everybody's spirits up and rallying the troops and so on, holding the group together, creating a sense of group cohesion and identity and so on, you know, making you band together. Okay, so 2 marks out of 5 for this one. There are 2 parts to the bullet as well, feelings in recent days and about Raposo. You have to mention them both. And there's no comments about the narrator's feelings in the passage that we read. There wasn't enough detail generally throughout the piece, but there were some general points made about Raposo, but no specific details or development. Or the development here might be why you feel what you feel towards Raposo. What do you think about him as a leader? Is he a good leader or a bad leader? Why or why not? And that involves some imagination as well, based on developing ideas that you've read in the passage. Third and last point here, possible points for A3, that's the last A, evidence of human activity. So 2 out of 5 again for content here. Evidence of human activity, development, building, Raposo's expectations of finding a city. There are huge mineral resources. None of the other points were mentioned. So this last point requires reading between the lines. So you have to kind of look for the clues and piece together the picture and think about what's suggested or hinted at or implied, or how you might take some of those clues and infer from them what you know, what you might felt on the last day. What is needed here is a close reading of the passage. You really need to look at it carefully. The focus of this section is what has happened since you saw the broken remains of the human settlement. You aren't told what's happened since you saw the broken remains of the human settlement. You have to infer what's happened or what might have happened. And you also still need to, we're still writing the journal form, include your thoughts and feelings and your fellow adventurers' experience. So these are the kinds of things that you might want to include. So you were all elated, you were overjoyed, you were over the moon to find this settlement and all these remains. Raposo could hardly believe as the day ended that they'd made such a momentous discovery. And you know, there was some detail there. He picked up the axe in a daze, spun around and stared at them. He wanted to carry on and explore, or maybe he was disappointed, or you know, so it could be one of two possible options there. Maybe he was angry, maybe he was happy to see the reactions of the adventurers. Maybe they all experienced a kind of huge adrenaline rush, a buzz as they made these exciting discoveries, and it sort of erased the memory of the last few days, the ordeal of it all, and the exhaustion and the, you know, the interminable trek across the harsh terrain and the difficulties and the physical exhaustion they'd experienced. Maybe that just sort of wiped it all from their memories, because that's how humans are sometimes. We tend to forget the bad experiences and just focus on the positive sometimes. Looking back retrospectively, we tend to think, oh, the good old days. We don't tend to remember all the bad things. Okay, that was a I don't know if I put what mark that was. Oh, here it was, yeah. So it was a D/C grade, mainly because, and I think it's really important here to recognize that the way that this is marked, okay? There are 5 content marks for each bullet point. And if you don't find those pieces of information, you limit your score. So it's very, low scoring there for the content. The writing marks, the language was sort of a bit plain. It didn't really meet the conventions or reflect what we'd expect from a journal entry. There wasn't really enough development, there wasn't enough detail. It was a bit short anyway, so there wasn't much opportunity to develop those. So fully understand, make sure you understand what the question is requiring and what you need to do. Look at the whole text. Remember that you're writing a journal entry, and remember that you're marked for both content and quality of writing here. And you need to find those 5 pieces of information for each bullet point. Structure was okay. It followed basically the structure was all right, but it didn't really go into enough detail and depth explaining what the narrator saw, where they went, what happened, and the thoughts and feelings at the various stages as well. So that's why this candidate didn't score as highly as they could have. So that's just to illustrate that. And so finally, the writer's effects question. We're nearly there, guys, nearly there. Hang on in there. So this is the writer's effects question, which is tied to the passage that the previous question was based on as well. Okay, so you'll remember that text C on paper 1 is used as the basis for the writer's effects and the extended response task. Okay, so this is the writer's effects question. So make sure you're looking at the right paragraphs. Choose 3 examples of words or phrases from each paragraph. You're writing about a side. So that's about 5 to 6 lines for each of your examples. You are looking at 6 examples in total from 2 paragraphs, and you must include an overview, guys. Okay, so actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at, oh wait a moment, hold on. Yeah, I'm going to look at the criteria first of all. Okay, so what they want to see in a top band response is a wide-ranging discussion of judiciously selected language with some high quality comments that add meaning and associations to words and phrases in both parts of the text and demonstrate the writer's reasons for using. What does that mean? It means you've chosen good examples. You're looking for examples of words and phrases which have layers of meaning. So we don't just want to choose a word like tired, right? Because that's just a very literal meaning. There's not much to say about that. You want to choose words or phrases which have depth and layers of meaning that can be peeled back and explored and analyzed. You can think about, the associations and the connotations of it. So that's one thing, and I'll show you with when we look at the response, some examples of that from the passage. And you want to add high quality, so the quality of the analysis is good, and you want to think about the associations that those words and phrases have, and that will lead you to thinking about why the writer has chosen them, because the writer doesn't just include these words and phrases because they feel like showing off their ability to use a fancy metaphor, an impressive simile. The point is, it's supposed to achieve an effect, to create a mood or to convey something to the reader, or an impression, create an impression on the reader. So that's basically what you're looking for. And that will show that you've understood and you've demonstrated that you know and you can explain how language works. Okay, so essentially that's what you're looking for. And you'll see that level 4 and level 3 are the same, but doing that less well, if you see what I mean. So there's some evidence that the candidate understands how language works, so maybe they haven't explained each word and phrase fully, which then therefore indicates they don't have a full grasp of how language can be used. Okay, so here's the response. Here's the question. Here's the response. In paragraph 2, the writer uses very effective imagery to describe the mountain. The sides lit up in flames shows the light on the mountain, and the imagery is extended in, for it had been raining and the setting sun reflected from wet rocks, rich in colour and light. The explanation as to why the mountains are coloured in this way allows the reader to accurately imagine the mountains. The sun reflecting off the wet rocks provides an effective and imaginable setting, and a simile is used to describe the rocks as like gems. The writer describes streams of water which leap between rocks as a rainbow, which further adds to a semantic field of colour on the mountain. The water is personified as leaping between rocks. Thus, not only does the water have colourful natural beauty, it also has living characteristics. That's all that he's written about paragraph 2. In paragraph 4, the description of the mountainous area has completely changed. The vibrant descriptions of the mountains are contrasted with the description of the crags as being black and menacing. The personification of the crags as being menacing is an effective change in characteristics of the mountain. Okay, Lewis, I'll come to your question in a moment. I'll come to your question towards the end. Let's just finish this one first, all right? Okay, the writer describes streams of water which leap, I've read that bit, haven't I? In paragraph 4, the description of the mountainous area has completely changed. The vibrant descriptions of the mountains are contrasted with the description of the crags as being black and menacing. The personification of the crags as being menacing is an effective change in characteristics of the mountain. The quick transformation from beautiful to dark and threatening emphasizes how much the views of the adventurers has changed. The group has been tired out by traveling for so long, which is emphasized further when they begin trying to scale the mountain. To the eyes of many, it's important to put a comma in. To the eyes of many, their height was vast, and when the party reached them, it was to find sheer, unscalable precipices. Is used to heighten the sense that the group is very tired. To most people, the mountains appear very tall, but to the party, the mountain is completely unclimbable. Is that a word, unclimbable? The juxtaposition between the two views emphasizes how devoid of energy the team is. The near impossibility of the party climbing the mountain is further heightened in all day they struggled over boulders and crevices, seeking a way up those glossy sides. The team spent all day climbing the mountain, and the difficulty which they faced is shown when the mountain sides are shown as being glossy. To the reader, the fact that the sides are glossy will create an image of the sides being very slippy, which allows the reader to comprehend the difficulty and danger of climbing the mountains. In summary, the writer provides a highly effective description of the mountains, describing the phenomena of light occurring on the mountain and describing the rainbow-like water on the mountain, while drawing the reader's attention to a sudden change in view of the mountain from being well-lit, colourful, and seemingly studded with gems to being dark, menacing, and death-like. Okay, so this is what the mark scheme said. So these are the kinds of ideas, but that's first paragraph you're asked to look at, paragraph 2. You need to include an overview, guys. You need to include an overview. So some general sentence summing up what the overall impression is in that paragraph. about the mountains, the sight of the mountains to the weary adventurers. Use the wording of the question to help you. No ordinary mountain. So these are the phrases that might have been picked out, and what might be said about them. So no ordinary mountains, they're very large, they're unusual, strange, mysterious. So think about synonyms for what this means. No ordinary. Something that's not ordinary is unusual, strange, exceptionally large, or somehow out of the ordinary, not what's expected, maybe. And I think the point here is that they are they present a significant challenge, don't they, to overcome a seemingly insurmountable barrier, obstacle, right? Lit up in flame. So from the beginning, this is made clear, that's communicated. So lit up in flame, well, straight away, that's a metaphor. The mountain is not actually on fire, is it? So what you're actually describing, what the writer is describing here is the shades. It's illuminated in shades of red and orange, right? Illuminated because fire gives off light, doesn't it? And the colors that it gives off are red and orange. It's brightly colored. Maybe that could be seen as a beacon or a sign to the adventurers. Certainly, it's an image, or it's a visual image which inspires a sense of wonder, sort of breathtaking beauty and awe. Okay, the wet rocks, rich in color and light. So there's lots of water there on the surface of the rocks, but it's studded. So it's sort of like, it creates a visual image of the appearance of the rocks, right? Rich in color and light. So rich can have more than one meaning, right? Rich can be having depth, and it can also mean valuable, as in equates to lots of money, kind of has a monetary value, right? And that should be a separate point. They're studded with gems. So that's actually, there aren't really literally gems like semi-precious rocks on the surface of this mountain. It looks like it's a metaphor there, like it's something like a decorative piece. It's quite beautiful. And think about what gems makes you think of. So that's where the associations comes in, right? The streams are leaping rock from rock. That's one example that the student did look at. It is personifying the stream, but it's doing more than that. So think about what the action of leaping is. It's not the same as jumping, right? Leaping suggests a playfulness, almost like a child sort of jumping hopscotch, or like stepping stones, personifying the image, personifying the water in this way creates a sort of impression of it being light and nimble, and it's a joyful image as well. So a rainbow beckons, so like a person sort of enticing you, summoning you, offering the promise of fortune and wealth. Okay, so this is what's in the mark scheme. And in the second one, we've got overview. The mountains appear impossible to climb because of their size and physical features. They're hostile. So it's menacing, dangerous, difficult, and yeah, threatening, right? So the crags appear black and menacing. So they're very dark in color. Threatening is a good synonym for menacing. They sort of almost have this malevolent intent. And that's a huge contrast, which this candidate did mention, to the sunset on the mountains, the beautiful appearance of that the night before. So there is a contrast there that you could comment on. Vast means enormous in scale, and that symbolizes the difficulty, the challenge that lies before them, right? Sheer, unscalable precipices. I like this one. I'd probably choose this one, right? Sheer means very steep, almost vertical, right? And that means very, very difficult to climb, obviously. That means it's sort of, and precipice is also like on the edge. There's a sense of danger there. All day they struggled over there, trying continuously. Maybe that suggests their feelings of defeat, and they're quite disheartened, kind of feeling like they're not making much progress. I probably wouldn't have chosen that one, because I like ones which have, I like metaphors and similes and imagery. And this one, I think, there's not as much to say. But it is in the mark scheme. Seeking a way up those glossy sides. I like that as well. I like the sibilants. Those of you who know my classes, you'll know I like sound effects. So glossy sides. It doesn't mention that in the mark scheme, but I would probably mention the sibilants because it's sort of slippery. The slippery slopes. That's actually what it's saying, isn't it? Glossy sides, right? And slippery means, well, glossy means like think a coat of varnish or a coat of paint or something that's been polished. It's very like glass, you know, it's something that is slippery because it's low friction, right? And it's shiny with that. And that suggests, well, it's a juxtapose actually, because it looks appealing. Something that's sort of glossy might seem appealing on one level, superficially attractive, but deceptive at the same time, you know, because it's sort of there's danger lurking on those slippery slopes, right? Because it's very difficult. Fine. Right, so here's the first part. The issue is that there are no there's several issues with this response. So the first thing is there's no overview sentence. The examples that are picked are chosen. They're good examples, but the student hasn't explained them fully and doesn't actually break down. You've got to break down what this means. So I just told you that I just said that lit up in flame, and this is a way that you could do that. It's a metaphor, lit up in flame. It's not literally on fire, so therefore it's a metaphor. It describes the appearance of the mountainside as resembling a fire, as you know, it was creating a visual impression in the reader's mind of the mountain appearing as though it's on fire. And there are vibrant shades of red and orange reflected from the setting sun that illuminate the mountain sides, the slopes. And I think that creates a sense of awe and wonder, and maybe they see it as a sign, like a beacon of light and hope. And so none of that is explained here. Notice it's not explained. Just saying it's if another thing to mention is there is no point in saying something like this. The writer uses very effective imagery to describe the mountain. That does not earn you anything because it's not telling me anything. It's not telling me anything about this image. How does this image work? What does it do? What does it make me think of? What does it make me, what do I associate with it? And what effect does it have? And that's it. That's it for that first image. The sides lit up on the flame shows that the light on the mountain shows the light on the mountain. What about the light on the mountain? What does it be specific? Be specific is the question, is the point to make here. It had been raining and the setting sun reflected from wet rocks, rich in color and light. All imagery allows you, it should do, to imagine something. So that's just too general, okay? You need to explain. What does it make you visualize? What do you see in your mind's eye? Similarly, the phrase like gems is not explained. It's a simile, but you need to go beyond that and say, what does that mean? It means this is a suggested response, studded with gems. This metaphor creates a vivid visual image of the mountains as decorated with expensive precious stones like diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, which have been polished and fashioned into expensive jewelry so that their many facets shine and reflect the light. By likening the sight to gems, the writer suggests the beauty of the scene as well as how rare and precious it is. Gems are, well, if you think gems, what you think of: beautiful, rare earth minerals, expensive, valuable, precious. Those are the words that come to mind. Now string those words into a sentence. Okay, so that's what you want to do. And what does that create an impression of? It's beautiful, it's rare, it's like jewelry. Gems are used in jewelry, aren't they? Mostly. Okay, the writer describes streams of water which leap between the rocks as a rainbow. Again, there are two examples mentioned here. And you need 3 for the first paragraph and 3 for the second. So there's no point writing 4. Writing about 4 won't give you, you won't get any more marks for that. And there's not enough, again, detail on the explanation there. Just saying it's personified or saying it's a simile or a metaphor, you can actually get top marks without saying that. It's your explanation and how you analyze it that's the most important thing. Not being able to spot a simile or a metaphor. It's not enough just to do that. So the streams leaping from rock to rock could be, a better response would be the personification of the water running in the channel as leaping suggests it moves rapidly, lightly, crossing the rocks as though they are stepping stones, like a nimble-footed child. It is a positive image which creates a playful mood. So I'd suggest you put your overview at the beginning because it helps to keep your focus on the right sort of the overall impression. So it's all tied in to the overall impression of that in that paragraph. This was a borderline D/C grade. So given you a range of different responses. And I just wanted to go back to, where was it now? Hold on a sec. Just pause the screen share while I go to the right slide. Yeah, this one. Be specific. These are your top points, your top tips, rather. So what you want to do is use the LICE template. So think about the literal meaning, paraphrase, use synonyms. So explain what these words mean, the literal meaning of the words and phrases, the words and phrases that you choose. Don't pick too long an example. So one word or a phrase of 2 to 3 words is ideal in most cases. Picking a long sentence or a phrase that's more than 5 or 6 words is going to be too much to say. And think about the implicit meaning. So what does that word, image, phrase suggest to you? What does it make you, what's hinted at? What connotations does it have? In other words, what does it make you think of? What associations? So I just did that with gems with you. Okay, so gems make us think certain things. We associate certain things with gems. So say that. And then think about what the effect is. So we did that with gems as well. So that suggests that the scene is one of beauty, rare beauty, is precious, and it's something that fills you with a sense of wonder, and it's beautiful, the scene. So that brings us to the end. And I did cover everything that I thought I would. Just took me a little bit longer than I thought it would. So I hope you found that useful. I'm just gonna, does anybody have any, there was a question, hold on, I'll have a look at that. And what you want to do, I've already looked at this bit here. And so this is basically my final thought for you guys. Do your best and good luck with it. And I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat. Does anybody else have any questions? Another revision book suggested for the directed writing question to plan and write the pros in one paragraph and cons in another rather than ping pong the points. Is that okay to do as well? It is okay. It is okay to do that. So what you're saying is, and I always put this as a game of 2 halves or a game of ping pong. So you could do it in 2 halves, and it partly depends on what you prefer, and it partly depends on what it is you're writing about. But the reason why I say ping pong is because what you're saying is you'd have your introduction and your conclusion. And in the middle, what you've got is 2 halves. That's why I call it a game of 2 halves. So the first half, sandwiched between the introduction and conclusion, is all the pros. And the second half is the cons. You could do it like that. The problem is, it's not so much a problem. I just think it might not be as effective as if you weigh up the pros and cons together, because some of them go well together, and some of the cons are counter arguments to pros. Does that make sense? So it makes sense, especially if you're discussing something, to kind of think, on the one hand, some people say study exchange programs waste huge amounts of teachers' time and resources. However, on the other hand, many people feel that this is time well spent, energy well spent, because the benefits they bring are significant and so on. It's positive and it's advantageous for students to go on these study exchange programs. Do you see what I mean? So I think it's a more sophisticated structure if you do ping pong. Myself is what I think that that's conflicting with your revision book. So, but personally, I feel that works that creates a more polished piece. And it allows you to balance and evaluate the points against each other. Does that make sense? So go with what you feel you're most comfortable with, and think about, in your planning stage, think about which approach is going to work best and which do you feel most confident with as well. Okay, so, for some students, maybe the game of 2 halves approach is better because, they feel kind of on safer ground with that. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, Lewis. Thank you for that. It's a good question. And that about wraps up for today. I hope you found it helpful. Best of luck. Not long to go now, guys. Hang in there. And see you on the other side. You're welcome, Mia. You're welcome. Let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear how it all goes, and let me know if anything I've said has helped you, because that would be really great for me to hear. All right. Thanks, guys. Take care. I'm glad it was helpful, Lewis. Take care. See you next time. Well, not see you next time. On the other side. Bye.